muchísimas gracias a todos por estar aquí a este seminario titulado El radicante y no el radical. El radicante, crítica del pensamiento postmoderno, impartido por Nicolas Bourriaud, a quien agradecemos enormemente que esté hoy con nosotros. Siempre lo decimos, cada vez que presentamos a alguien, que es un grandísimo honor, pero nunca faltamos a la verdad cuando lo decimos, y en esta ocasión no va a ser menos. Es un grandísimo honor poder contar con una figura de la talla y el prestigio internacional e intelectual de Nicolas Bourriaud, que, bueno, todos conocéis su trayectoria como comisario, ha dirigido el Palais de Tokio, ha fundado la revista Documents sur l'Art, ha sido comisario de gran número de exposiciones, ha dirigido bienales. Podría quizá dar una conferencia simplemente enumerando pues, las iniciativas en las que en los últimos 15 años ha estado envuelto, todas ellas fundamentales para el desarrollo del arte contemporáneo. La figura de Bourriaud es quizá una rara avis dentro del mundo del arte contemporáneo, porque quizá es el ejemplo en el que mejor se combina el mundo de la academia, el mundo de la intelectualidad, el mundo de la crítica, la teoría o la historiografía crítica del arte contemporáneo, y el mundo de la práctica, el mundo más candente de las exposiciones, quizá. Toda su obra teórica va encaminada hacia ese campo, ¿no? Hacia ese mundo a medio camino entre una cosa y la otra. Autor de libros tan fundamentales para comprender el mundo del arte en el que nos movemos, como Desde, débil, el arte moderno y la invención del individuo, la invención del ser, que probablemente se ha traducido por el CENDEAC a lo largo de este año. El más conocido por todos, Estética relacional, que, pues bueno, si se puede hablar de bestseller dentro del mundo del arte, quizá este sea uno de los ejemplos, ¿no? Un libro fundamental sin el cual no se puede entender pues el desarrollo del arte contemporáneo, o el más reciente, Postproducción, también otro claro ejemplo de del modo en el cual trabaja Bourriaud, que es con la clarificación de conceptos claves y la proposición de ejemplos o de individuos que ponen en obra esos conceptos. Yo creo que la labor de Nicolas Bourriaud es inestimable dentro del mundo del arte contemporáneo, y a mí me parece que es quizá antes que otra cosa, antes que un comisario, antes que un crítico, que un teórico, un cartógrafo. Y un cartógrafo en el sentido en el que la cartografía tenía para los antiguos, no solo como representación de un mundo, sino como creación de realidad en torno a ese mundo, como constatación. El mapa siempre, de algún modo, y no solo después de Borges, siempre creaba el territorio. El modo en el cual trabaja Bourriaud es precisamente de esa manera, aclarando y cartografiando territorios, cartografiando modos de producir, maneras de hacer como la estética relacional o la postproducción, o los conceptos en torno a los cuales trabaja, que son los conceptos en torno a los cuales se mueve, o los puntos nodales en torno a los cuales se mueve el mundo del arte contemporáneo, y presentando esos conceptos. Estos libros no solo son una relación de artistas, una relación de conceptos, no es solo un libro de historia que presenta un movimiento, que presenta una manera de hacer, sino que el mapa que se presenta en este tipo de libros contribuye a la constatación del territorio. Toda una serie de prácticas nacen, se consolidan y se reproducen, casi siguiendo la lógica del anuncio. Casi se consolidan, se reproducen en torno a estas obras, en torno a estos pensamientos. Es un modo de trabajar que me parece excepcional y, desde luego, muy raro, porque en este mundo en el que nos movemos, o tenemos ejemplos de la academia, críticos, teóricos, que viven desvinculados en ocasiones de las prácticas que se están realizando, o tenemos ejemplos de comisarios que, bueno, saben citar sin sonrojarse demasiado a Deleuze o a Negri, pero que realmente pues, no tienen un bagaje teórico fuerte. Quizá Bourriaud, el gran hallazgo que se da en la figura de Bourriaud es esa combinación de ambos lugares. En cualquier caso, pues bueno, me callo. Simplemente le reitero el agradecimiento por estar aquí con nosotros y por, bueno, acompañarnos durante estos 3 días, estos 2 días, 3 jornadas en los que tendrá lugar este seminario. Y nada más, le cedo la palabra.
Gracias. Va a ser muy difícil ahora, ¿no? Para mí. Bueno, muchas gracias por su presentación. I'm going to speak English, by the way, because if everybody's okay with this, you know. Y después podemos, vale, si hay preguntas en español, puedo contestar quizás en español, quizás en inglés, vamos a ver. But I took note in English, so let's skip to it. The idea of this first day was to maybe start with very general things, like a kind of very big landscape, and the biggest possible landscape today would concern the landscape, ideological landscape, I would say, the landscape, political, aesthetical landscape, starting from the modernism through postmodernism and beyond. And we don't know exactly what the beyond would be, actually. Because the main effect of the end of modernism and, of course, all its political side effects and the fall of the Berlin Wall, for example, is that our times don't have any grand narratives, like Lyotard was calling them, grand narrative that would embrace a landscape and give an impulsion, a movement that would make a lot of different signs gather together and produce a meaning. As we don't have this grand narrative, but maybe we have it and we don't know. Maybe we have a very precise intellectual object in front of us and we have no idea what it is because we cannot put words on it. So this is more or less at the moment the goal of my investigations. And I would start from a commentary, from a little line taken from a book by Peter Sloterdijk, the German philosopher, which is the following one. He writes, the primitive scene of modernity might have been the first derrick in the American desert, which means, in other words, that, and he tries to dwell on it a bit later, in the text, which might mean that modernism was actually about energy. It was an energetical idea. It was based on a state of development of the Western world and a certain relationship of the Western culture towards the world, towards the earth, towards the environment also. Meaning that modernism, according to Sloterdijk, is closely linked to combustion. Actually, it burns things out. You know, there's the idea of the exhaustion of natural resources, whose symbol would be the fossil energies, like the fossil fuel, like the oil, for example. Sloterdijk goes on saying that actually modernism, the logics of modernism is the logics of the explosive motor. It's waste, speed, and overabundance. It is all what 20th century was about, in a way. It swallows energy and space. That's what modernism was about. Western modernism was closely linked to this very specific model of economics, which is the idea of exponential growth. And it's not totally by random if modernism stops and fails at the exact moment of the crisis of energy in the mid-70s. We could go back to this idea of combustion and modernism, because it's a very intriguing idea. Actually, it could be developed, of course, for hours. But look at Dadaism, for example. If you look at Dada, the chaotic activities of Dada were also based on this idea of a kind of waste of energy. The spontaneity was the rule, actually. That is the main concept of Dada, is spontaneity. Whatever an artist spits, it's art. Kurt Schwitters. And you have, of course, futurism, more or less at the same moment, a little bit earlier, who was talking about war as a kind of hygiene of life, in a way. You need wars as a kind of potlatch, actually, to renew the energy. But we need this huge amount of destruction in order to keep being modern, in a way. That was futurism was about. And of course, I could, take long lines, from it, towards throughout the 20th century, going on. If we only have to remind us a few examples of it, we could take, for example, the big work presented by Jean Tinguely in New York at the MoMA in 59, as far as I remember, or 60, which was a tribute to New York, which was a sculpture which was meant to explode, and which exploded actually during the opening after a few hours of functioning. You could also talk about Yves Klein and the fire and combustion, and the fact that he was developing a metaphysics of energy which was closely linked to the utopian modernism. But on another side, you have overconsumption also. It's not only about explosion, it's also about the explosion of the economy, in a way. And pop art is a very good example of it. Pop art is about overconsumption. It's about how to get more than more, how to duplicate even the desire you have for an object. And there would be also, even in minimal and conceptual art, a theater of explosion, in a way, and spilling, for example. You have, as examples, Robert Barry dropping gas in the atmosphere in 1967. You have Richard Serra throwing lead against the walls of the gallery. You have Barry Lever spilling forms, out on the floor. And a bit later, you have, of course, still artists working in this way, like Roman Ziegner from Switzerland, who's using explosions as a kind of basis for his vocabulary. So you see, there will be a whole story of the 20th century to be made out of explosions and overconsumptions and potlatch, in a way. And the idea that energy has to be consumed, and that we need, and that was modernity in a way was about, this idea of an everlasting progress, which is closely linked to it. It's the idea of the exponential growth, which again leads the ideological, is the ideological frame of modernism, in a way. And so the end of the avant-garde are exactly corresponding to the energy crisis starting at the end of 1973, and slowly introducing a big world crisis till the end of the 1970s. And over. That's the exhaustion of the modernist model, actually, of the explosive model of modernism. But you see, also, because things are never that clear in history. You have, from the end of the 60s, artists already working, in a way, on another type of models. For example, you have very interesting mise en scène of the idea of entropy by Robert Smithson, which already is totally away from this modernist explosive model. You have artists like Gordon Matta Clark exploring the subterranean world, digging, excavating, to talk about a project that we are preparing. Descending steps for Bataan, for example, in the mid-70s is a very interesting counterpoint to what we've been talking before. It's exactly the opposite of the explosive model. It's digging things out. It's excavating things. It's an archaeology already. And another very important artist exploring this world of entropy, because entropy is the degradation of energy. Entropy is the moment where energy goes to zero, actually. And the duo of German artists, Bernd and Ila Becher, for example, are a very good example of this. What those artists are showing, in a way, since the end of the 60s, is nothing less than the agony of the productivist process, in a way. And it's visible, clearly visible in the work. You have entropy dominating, suddenly, against the negentropy of modernism. Negentropy, which is the acceleration of energy. You could find also, in a way, I quote it at the last moment, because he's, in a way, he's a counterpoint almost to everything in the 20th century. You could quote Marcel Duchamp as a good counterpoint. Since in 1913, he started to work on what he called shy energies. Energies recuperated from, for example, I quote, the excess of pressure on a plug, the way you exhale tobacco smoke, the way the hair grows, and the nails, or the fall of urine and excrements, the impulsive movements of fear, and etc., etc. It's what he called, he wanted to invent a recording apparatus to collect and transform those shy energies, the little manifestations of energies in excess or lost of the human being. And in a way, this is a kind of manifesto for another version of modernism, actually, which would be based not on the idea of an exponential growth, but on recycling things. And the Duchamp, whose main figure is the one of the bachelor, the broyeuse de chocolat, is very logical, actually. And the figure of the bachelor, in a way, is a pure recycling process. And that's the way, at least, Duchamp shows it and draws it in his work. So art as a transformer, an energy transformer. It's a way to recycle everyday life forms. And still at the end of the 60s, where this kind of counter movement, within modernism is developing, you can have an artist like Douglas Hubler, for example, who says, and this quotation is really important at this time, the world is full of objects, and I don't want to add more. It's already a kind of ideology of recycling. It's an ecological way of thinking, in a way. It's a kind of stop to production, or the idea of another type of production, a production which would not add new things, but that would recycle already existing things. And that's mainly what I try to talk about in the book Post-Production. But so we could see very easily, if we were following this line, that from the beginning of the 20th century, within the heart of modernism and the modernist ideology, which is totally the opposite of it, that there is a kind of a secret line of artists who are, in a way, trying to create an aesthetics of soft energy, of sustainable development, in a way, what we today call sustainable development. And this long introduction based on energy was meant, in a way, to introduce to the notion to this question: what would be our grand narrative? What is the big story that we should tell to each other in order to have a common story? Because postmodernism was, I say was and not is, you noticed, characterized by the explosion of narratives and the explosion of identities, actually. What is our common ground? It's belonging to a smaller community, in a way. It's being a man or a male or a female, gay or heterosexual, Indian in America, or, etc., etc. Small communities which recreate on a smaller scale narratives, stories to keep people together, in a way. Otherwise, we would live in a world where, it would not be possible actually to even have a culture, in a way. If we have nothing to say to each other, there's no way we can develop any type of culture. So I would call this minor narratives, actually are today facing a kind of dead end street, in a way. And the historical moment we're living is, according to me, characterized by the search for a new grand narrative, or a way to combine minor narratives together, I would say. It does not mean to reinvent modernism, of course. It's not, the idea is not to fall into this kind of nostalgia or being conservative or about it. But the fact is, it won't be possible to invent this new model for culture without a new model for economy, actually. And finally, the lack of the one creates the lack of the other one. And so maybe it's important to start from the most banal and most, general situation, which is what? Which is that we are living in a globalized world. The globalization movement is certainly the most important phenomenon today. It's certainly the movement, the collective movement that drives us the most today, whether we know it or not, whether it's invisible for you or not. It's a fact, actually. So this globalized world, whose birth could be dated eventually from the fall of the Berlin Wall, is absolutely inseparable from the discourse called postmodernism that has been developed, from the end of the 70s, mainly in Western Europe and the United States, and spread out in a way because it was a neutral enough, let's say, to include newcomers in the game. And finally, 1989, which is the date for the first global exhibition, which was introducing itself as such, which is Les Magiciens de la Terre at the Pompidou Center in Paris. it happened in May, and the same year, 89, the Berlin Wall fell, creating a totally different world, not based on the opposition between two radically different ways of understanding the world, reading it, and on reading it, and which was supposed to be a pacified world, actually. At the beginning of the 90s, everybody was saying, well, okay, the market has won. We're entering a world where there will be no conflicts. We're entering a world of free market where, every country only had to wait for the miracle of its economical boom, like in Thailand or China, or etc. And then everything would be fine. And concerning the art world, no problem neither. Of course, the artists from China or India or Africa, would participate to this big, very comprehensive, very tolerant art world, and there would be absolutely no problem, no antagonisms, actually. But the fact is, it did not happen that way at all. And it's Slavoj Žižek was saying that contrarily to what was said, the 90s were an explosion of utopias, actually. The utopia of liberalism as able to handle the destiny of the world, in a way, and putting an end to every possible war or conflict. And from this end of the 70s, was constituted a discourse about art, about culture, and about the world, which was based on a few ideas, a few elements that are important to decode. The first element of this discourse, this postmodern discourse, is that modernist universalism, which was, universalism was very much linked to modernism. There was this idea of, spreading out all over the world, exactly like the communist utopia also, which was supposed to reign over the world, of the whole world. Universalism is absolutely inseparable from modernism. Exactly like energy, actually. Energy had to spread out. Modernism too. Everything had to spread out, actually. Secondly, the vocabulary, for example, of abstraction, pictorial abstraction, was suddenly considered as a kind of tool used by this modernist universalism which was used as a kind of colonial war machine, in a way. Modernism was about colonization. Abstraction was the main, the symbol, in a way, of modernism, was suddenly considered also as a war machine for colonialism, for Western colonialism and Western hegemony, I would say. And also the notion of progress, of course, in art, which was, you only have to read the writings of Clement Greenberg, for example, to understand what this notion of progress was meaning. It was really present, and actually, in this postmodern discourse, this notion was totally deconstructed as a kind of Western fascination for the progress itself, and in particular the progress of technology, for example. So the idea that was developed at this moment was that modernism was the kind of Trojan horse for colonialism, and this discourse has shaped the world of the art world since the end of the 70s. This ideology has a name, which is postmodernism, and it presents itself as a sincere critique of the imperialism of the industrialized countries. But it also functions in another way, if you read it carefully. It also dissimulates the genuine lines of political fracture within society. In the post-industrial world, the political debate since this period has seen itself atomized into a multiplicity of statements carried by sexual minorities, ethnical, social, national, cultural minorities. And none of them, of course, proposes a global vision of society. We're into a split screen situation. And the split screen, it's not by random neither, is a very dominant form today also. It's the form of the zapping also in a way. Every idea, every notion, every aspect of this ideology has not only an impact, but a translation into forms, into the way we frame the world. And so we are living the era of split screen in a way. So even though those arguments are understood to be legitimate in principle, and it's not our goal to destroy them, without examining them and examining their content, but they turn out actually to be, in a way, empty due to their incapacity to connect to the power, in a way. A notion which is closely linked to postmodernism is the notion of multiculturalism. Multiculturalism has become a kind of standard, I would say. And it pretends to resolve the problem of modernism from what I would call a quantitative point of view. There are more and more cultural specificities, and of course, it's most of the time positive, it's not the problem. But there is something which is a problem. There's a new, of course, we could say that there is a new internationalist spirit that has taken up the relay of the modernist universalism in one way. But it lies also in the internationalism, of folklores and of identities. And this notion of identity is certainly the most problematic that we have to face, and it certainly is the poison within the sweet of multiculturalism, I would say. There's a very emblematic book written by Charles Taylor, which is called The Recognition of the Multiculturalism, and the Politics of Recognition, which was written in 1902. And Charles Taylor, who is a theoretician of the politics of recognition, which is the basis of multiculturalism, considers as a vital human need the dignity of cultural minorities into a national community. And funnily, if you read the book, there is something which is never addressed, which is the fact that actually Charles Taylor is talking about America. He's talking about the United States. He understands and promotes multiculturalism within the limits, within the borders of one state. And the book is absolutely ununderstandable if you get out of this, a priori idea. Which means that actually multiculturalism is an auxiliary of the notion of nation, actually. It's understandable as a way of coexistence between different communities within the frame of a state, and nothing more than that. And this model actually is the model through which we understand multiculturalism. And we never really envision it as within another type of situations than the national one, in a way. Because beyond the nation and its borders, what is globalization? Nobody answers, in a way. it's in this way that I really believe that multiculturalism, seen from that point of view, could be considered as an invisible agent of isolationism, and that the pretended cultural diversity could also reinforce the power of the nation. Let's go back a little bit beyond to another set of discourses which are really important to understand what postmodernism is. I'm talking about the book of Frantz Fanon called The Damned of the World, written in 1961. And this book is important because it's a model of anti-colonial discourse. And Frantz Fanon in this book says that the absolute weapon of the colonialists consisted in imposing their image on those of the subjected people. And it would be necessary, say his disciples today, to substitute a very real historic pluralism to this history of the dominant dead white males history. And what is really interesting is that for modernist universalism, artistic production had to be judged according to the historical criteria of this linear history that was deplored by Frantz Fanon. The notion of newness, for example. What is new? You know, if you read any book of art history written before 1970, you will find this word, new. It's the first time that. It's new, etc., etc. Newness had accompanied modernism as a ghost, in a way. And it's a word we never use anymore. It has totally disappeared from our vocabulary if we talk about art. Eventually, if we talk about computers or video games, we can say new. But we are, even without thinking about it, we abandoned even the concept of it, which is really funny, actually. But this notion of newness was introducing a hierarchy between the artists, in a way. A very important artist was the first one to do something. And slowly, there was another version of the history of art that was developed. And I would only quote the Fluxus artist, who's a very important artist, by the way, George Brecht, who in the 1960s was saying that it was much more difficult to be the 8th or the 9th to do something, because to be the first one is very easy, but to be the 8th you have to really aim well, you know, and be very precise. On the other hand, so that multiculturalism and the postmodern way of thinking that was introduced in the 70s leads a kind of relativism which attacks the very notion of judgment, actually, about art. I've read many texts saying that to understand the production, the artwork of such or such artists, you, in a way, had to be part of the community, you know, he or she was part of. And it's a kind of deviance which is very spread out also today. And of course, it destroys and dilutes the very notion of community as the fact that we have something to say to each other in common, and that we are able to share a same space and talk about not the same things, but to understand each other, you know, establishing a level of understanding that makes us, you know, able to talk in a way. If you push this form of reasoning, of postmodern reasoning, to its extreme, it would mean that it's necessary to be part of a community in order to be permitted to critique the works of an artist from this community. I push it to the extreme, but that's the reasonment that that is at stake. And this this pulverization of criterions is, of course, linked to the end of the grand narratives that we were talking about at the beginning. There's no common story, in a way. So, what would impeach us to develop, in a way, our micro stories? And I'm not opposing one model to another, and I'm warning, because at the end I might, effectuate a kind of synthesis between the two, or at least propose a third model than these ones. But micro stories on one side and the grand narrative on the other side are both, notions that produce a certain type of ideology and a certain type of way to envision art, I would say. Because what's really striking as the modernist sphere of universalism was totally destroyed is that the only common ground that we all have is the sphere of technique, actually. Just have a look at the last documenta in 2002. There was something which was very dominant, is the presence of technology, in a way. You have huge screens, projections, etc., etc. This is a kind of Esperanto for us now. The video image, at least, and the way artists handle the camera is something which is new basis for a common ground, in a way. We are entering into a sphere where the only common point we all have together is the level of technology, actually. And you're a little bit downer or at the right level. If you're down, okay, you're in a peripheric country. But the artists from those peripheric countries use so-called peripheric, of course, because I don't think it's a very relevant term, use technology as a kind of green card to get into the game of the art world, in a way. Is it by random that today the more specific artists are about their conditions of existence, about where they come from, about the specificity of their cultural backgrounds, it's most of the time proposed into the form of video. And this is a way also to make it, acceptable by the market and the art world in general. We're living into a technical space that we are given to share, in a way. This technical space is expressed by this new Esperanto of the art world, which is the video image. Is that the only possible common story we could share? Is that the only tale that we could tell to each other, to keep the illusion we're living in the same world? And not necessarily think that. But we have to ask ourselves maybe the right questions, and trying to start, and I'm starting again from scratch, which is the level of globalization that we are living in at the moment, which is again certainly the most influential thing today. What is a global economy, actually? Let's start from a very simple question. A global economy is an economy which is able to function 24 hours a day and 7 days a week at a planetary level in real time. And in a way, it corresponds exactly to the fluxes of capitals, actually. So globalization is a matter of capitals first. It's the way money is transferred and money is invested, and so invisible inputs and outputs that are absolutely determinant to our everyday life, And that's the main thing we have to face at the moment. If generally today, if you're working in a factory, whatever it is, and there is what we call in France a social plan. I don't know how we call it in Spain. Social plan means that there are thousands of people fired at the same moment. And generally they don't understand, and they don't know even who fired them, because they have no idea. And it's kind of normal nowadays, because it's the shareholders mainly who have the real power in such a context. So those people are fired by somebody who's retreated in Miami, but they never saw him or her, and they will never saw him or her. The world we're living in is dominated by abstraction in this way. We are facing abstract figures. How do you represent money today? Not by banknotes. In the banknotes, we have from pesetas or francs, etc. We had painters on it or writers. Now we have bridges, which is a very interesting abstract way of figuring the world, and it's also a symptom of something. It's impossible to represent, to figure what's the most important thing today, which is the power, in a way. Because power is not anymore into castles or into parliaments. Power today does not build castles, it builds time. And it's through time that the power is expressing itself. For example, just one short example, the power of Coca-Cola is not represented by any building. It's represented by the fact that every 20 seconds you have an image of it on TV or whatever. No, it's the repetition of the information that makes the power. So it's a process which is a time process and not a space process anymore. So our whole idea of what representation is totally fucked up. We have to invent something else. And the problem is that for the moment, there is no such thing as a world culture. There is a world economy, but there is not a world culture to counter it, in a way. And this is almost a paradox, in a way, because we are supposed to have understood that universalism is dead, that nobody can now pretend, or inspire himself or herself from this idea of universalism, which is a very biased, Western-orientated, idea, Eurocentric idea, because we all understood that the core of universalism was the domination of the Western civilization over others. Okay, but once we said that, we have on the other side an economy which pretends to be universal but pretending having no ideas, actually. Economy has no ideas. It's a very pragmatic thing. It's supposed not to have any content, actually. And that's not exactly a paradox, but maybe more like a masquerade, in a way. Globalization has a main effect on culture. It's called standardization, uniformization. This is the movement of globalization. If you translate it into the sphere of culture, it means through the power of a certain civilizational model, spreading out the same objects all over the world, and the disappearance of the local traditions and the singularities, let's say. It's not totally true, by the way. On one hand, you have this movement of standardization, which is very, obvious. I don't need to make any drawings of it, I guess. But on the other hand, this movement of globalization creates very nationalistic reactions, crispations on people's identities and cultures. It's, oh, no, I'm not European, or I'm not a citizen of the world. I am from País Vasco. I am from Brittany, etc., etc. You're claiming that you're belonging to a cultural sphere that's the smallest possible, actually. That's and that has its own specificities, and you want to defend them. Okay. We are here with this debate between globalization and relocalization and renationalization, which is very important today with the development of nationalistic attitudes in Europe, for example. We're here at the core of what was modernism, in a way. And if I had to define what modernism was about, and what the 20th century was about, there would be one word which for me would be really important. This word is radical. Radicality. Radicalism. And this radicality, which is the essence of modernism, has an impact that maybe we did not envision enough. There's a very interesting book by Alain Badiou about this, which was called Le siècle, the century, who revisited the 20th century from this point of view of radicality. And what is radical? What does it mean? It means that belongs to the roots, that goes back to the roots. If you're radical, it means that you go back to the roots. You go back to the principle of things. You go back to the essential, the essence of something. You're really coming back to something. You eliminate then everything that is superfluous, everything that is not necessary. You cut it. You cut the branches of the tree to get back to the root. This is what 20th century was about. Eliminating all the anecdotes, to go back, like Kazimierz Malevich did, to the white on white painting. Go back to minimalism. Go back to the industrial object with Marcel Duchamp. Go back to the power of the unconscious with the surrealists. You see, every important movement of the 20th century is radical because it claims its return to the root, in a way, and the elimination of what is not the root. Of course, if you turn into politics, you have a radicality in politics is exactly the same. It's based on the same spirit of manifesto, which is manifesto. What is it? And Badiou explains it quite well in his book. He's saying that manifesto is a way to have the times, starting over. There's a before and one after the manifesto. You block the time, in a way. And that's a purely 20th century radical attitude. And one day, I was reading the dictionary, and I found the word which is exactly next to radical in the dictionary, which is radicante. It's a botanical term that exists in Spanish, in English, in French, and most of the. And radicante means, as opposed to radical that belongs to the root, it means. You can say that about an organism who's growing its own roots as it advances, like ivy, for example, or many, many plants. If you cut the original root of an ivy, it still goes. It does not need any origin. It goes by putting its roots wherever it goes. And suddenly I was thinking that this image of the radicante is a possible way to get out of those paradox between the standardization and the revendication of localness, is a way to get out of the dilemma between radicality and postmodernism, in a way. It's introducing a new paradigm, which takes a little bit of the two, in a way, without being the one, neither the other one. It's about an ethics of nomadism and cultural mobility. Of course, if we talk about botanics, the first thing we could say that it could look a little bit like the rhizoma that Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari have theorized in their book 1000 Plateau. But the rhizoma, the characteristics of the rhizoma, which is another botanical image, is the fact that every spot of the rhizoma is connected to the other ones. It's a circular form, the rhizoma. And the radicant process, in a way, there is more the constitution of a subjective line, actually. And as soon as I can, I will arrive to very concrete applications of this idea into art. But just in order to make myself understood, it's good to insist a little bit on this side. It's not about interconnection, it's about lines and the trajectory of a line. And the fact that this line grows, in a kind of dialogue with its environment. Any ivy, for example, can grow on another tree or on stones, for example. It doesn't care, It adapts itself through its trajectory to the accidents of the ground. In a way, this notion of radicantity brings me back to something I've been writing about before, which is the notion of the artist as a semionaut. From semios, the sign, and nautos, navigation. I once made a definition of the today's artist as opposed to the artist as a producer of objects, as somebody who produces pathways throughout culture, throughout the landscape of science that we are living in. The artist creates connections between science and produces itineraries within them into this socio-cultural space that we are living in. So the artist as a semionaut is building up a trajectory, in a way. And of course, it's this situation I've been trying to analyze a little bit in the post-production, which is a book about how do the artists produce today using already existing material. But if you put it to another level, it's this attitude and this way of working and producing is very characteristical of a universe that we're living in today, which is absolutely overfull of informations, actually. What is really strange, if you look into an art magazine like from 40 years ago, for example, is to see how the level of production has increased in an incredible way. How we are absolutely bombarded with informations and objects and cultural production, and it became really in an exponential way. We seem to be like overwhelmed by the incredible number of informations we have to digest all the time. And this situation of saturation, I would say, creates the collapse of the old hierarchies in knowledge. We are all medias in a way today, and we are all becoming more and more medias. We are at the center of multiple emissions and receiving as much, but there's no such distinction today between the two than it was the case, 50 years ago, for example. And the artist, in a way, is the one who, being aware of it, interrupts those rain of signals that we are bombarded, what we are, under all the time. He or she creates perturbations of the signals, and he or she creates links between them, connecting one sign to another in order to create a new form, in a way. And I think if I'm ask myself the question of what could be a radicant aesthetics, in a way, I would, spontaneously, quote a few notions. The first one being, let's say, the refusal of the assignation to any fixed tradition or any family of forms, in a way. And it can mean, for example, what I call post-production, which is inhabiting already existing forms, inhabiting somebody else's forms, being the lodger of culture, being not the one who produces, but the one who post-produces. It could also mean the determination of a long wandering, like being, totally, on a line and stopping, less and less. It's also the idea of a kind of cultural diaspora, a individual and chosen diaspora. The fact that today we are inhabiting circuits and trajectories, even more than places, actually. We don't have no stable places to start from. And today's identities are built also through a psychogeography, through go and returns between different spaces. We are commuters, in a way, more and more. And another aspect of this possible radicant aesthetics would be the notion of translation, actually, which is a very important one. It's not that far, because translation is a displacement. You move a linguistic object from one place to another. It's also about moving things, and accommodating them to another context, in a way. And here I would refer to the French ethnologist and anthropologist and epistemologist, also, and most of all, Bruno Latour, who explains that Western modernism had founded the international dialogue on scientific reason. And since the truth, because it was about truth, is undeniable, truth cannot be contested, in a way, and science was considered as a truth. And technical progress also, which is absolutely the same for all, that we were talking about before, this green card for for entering the art world. So technical progress and truth, and also in the modernist, ideology, was meaning that a kind of, let's say, evidence of universalism. There was no need for dialogue. That's what Bruno Latour is explaining. You don't need to dialogue with the other if the most important is the truth, and science is the truth, reason is the truth, and on the other hand, technical apparatus is the same for all, and it is not contestable neither. You cannot contest it in a way. Funnily, there was in the 1930s, the 1950s, a lot of histories between the proletarian science and the Western science, which was very, very interesting, because the Soviet scientists were absolutely ideologically opposed to Western science, and then it faded away. Actually, it was an episode of the Cold War about truth. And so modernism has nothing to do with dialogues, neither. You don't dialogue with somebody that you think that he or she is on your way, actually, but just behind you. He's not arrived yet, he's not ready, but sooner or later he will be. You don't have to dialogue, you have to teach to this person. And so that's why Bruno Latour explains that the concept of diplomacy is starting now and not before. It only starts today, because diplomacy, which is another way of saying translation, in a way, and negotiation, diplomacy presupposes that we do not speak the same language. And that's the most important. Diplomacy does not exist as such in the old modernist world. We, in a way, have to build it. And in cultural terms, it has huge consequences on the way we envision today's art, for example. I was saying a little bit before that, postmodernism was characterized by the fact that there was no real criterion of judgment. And that, for example, and that's what's worrying for me, an artist from Africa, from Cameroon, like Barthélemy Togo, or an artist like Naveen Ravanchaikul in Thailand, whoever, are most of the times not judged upon aesthetic criterions than in relation to their own culture, which puts the artists in the position of being the logotypes of their culture, of being the advertisers of their culture, in a way. And this is this situation of fragmentation, which is a problematic one, actually. It's not the fact that there is a dialogue, but in this position of folklorization of difference, I would say, there is no dialogue possible. There's only the acknowledgement and the acceptance of the other as such, but certainly no dialogue on a common ground based on universal criterions. So even if the concept of diplomacy is only starting, even if the concept of translation is only starting, they are still, in a way, void words, empty words. And we have to fill them with content, in a way. And I really believe that the most interesting aspects of this new culture, which is beyond postmodernism, which is arriving today, is based on this very notion of translation, actually. It means first to fight against the illusion of a universal language by a production of differences. And then the main problem, because it's not a contradiction with what I was saying before, the main problem is what to do with those differences. Which value do you give to them? What are they worth? A production of singularities is the condition of art, in a way. You cannot, be, I think, a very interesting artist if you're not producing a difference, in a way. But what do you do with it? And in a way, one could say that there is a kind of double language which is spoken by the artists of today's world today. If you take, for example, Rikrit Ravanija, who is an artist I've been quoting a lot, who's an artist from Thailand, using the codes of conceptual art and minimal art of the 60s and replacing those forms into a very specific problematics of nomadism, and eventually even introducing a little touch of Buddhist philosophy within the disposals, within the apparatus of the artists like Dan Graham or Donald Judd or Gordon Matta Clark. You have a kind of loop which is created by these artists. You have both something which is in a way singular, typical, so to say, from his culture, a dialogue within his culture, and a dialogue towards a broader audience, not in terms of quantity, but in terms of, let's say, it's difficult to avoid the word universalist, if you want to escape from this double bind, actually. But this work consists in a way in plugging specific cultural elements on an international level, so-called. It's like if it's a reloading process of modernism. It's a modernism which would be connected to the creolization of the world, creolization of cultures, connected to the fight for autonomy, connected to the possibility of singularity in a more and more standardized world. It's, in a word, a possible modernity made of translations, actually. And there is a very important issue about translating today, and which is concerning directly the shape of the artworks and the evolution of the artworks today. It's what I would call transcoding. It's like translating one format into another. It's the fact that today disciplinary fields are more and more, blurred. The boundaries between two disciplinary fields, between two disciplines, artistic disciplines, are really shifting, and moving a lot and erasing it themselves. And I would start with quoting Philippe Parenaud, who wrote a text about the group of artists who were absolute geniuses, according to me. General Idea, Canadian artists, who started in the 70s. And Philippe Parenaud said about General Idea, I quote, "In my view, they were the first to think about the possibilities of to think of the exhibition, not in terms of forms or objects, but formats of representation, or format of reading the world. The question that my work raises might be the following: what are the tools that allow us to understand the world?" And this question of the format today is for me absolutely crucial. It's absolutely central. Are we ready as artists or as curators or as culture amateurs, or whatever, to accept as such the formats were given, were provided? And the format of the formats, of course, being the TV format at the moment, which is the dominant format. It is the format which, through which we receive most of the images from the world that we have. And this question raises, you have an answer to this question, which is transdisciplinarity. It's very bad. It's getting us close to the TV. It's And there are many commentators of the art world who are ready to defend the notion of the medium, like painting, sculptures, etc., in order to defend the art world in a way against what could be considered as the invasion of the television format, in a way, or the dilution of the art world into a kind of a spectacle, I would say, without any reflexivity. There is a very interesting text about it, written by Rosalind Krauss, which is called Fiction as Medium. And in this book, she's it's not fiction as medium. What I'm saying, it's in French, the Passage du Nord-Ouest. I don't remember the title in English, but whatever. But it's embarrassing. Sorry, forget the reference. Well, later. So in this book, actually, Rosalind Krauss is discussing Marcel Brother's work. But Marcel Brother was one of the first artists in Belgium in the 70s, from the beginning of the mid-60s till his death in 75, to think a very different format for his work, which was fiction, actually. So he transformed himself as the promoter of an imaginary museum, which was the Musée d'Art Moderne, Département des Aigles. And the eagle became the symbol and the logo, in a way, of this fictitious enterprise. And Rosalind Krauss is, in a way, criticizing very harshly this not especially Brothers, but what came out of it, in a way. And she says that the eagle, for her, is the emblem that announces not the end of art, but the termination of the individual arts as medium-specific, and making art entering into a new era, which is, I quote, intermedia condition, in which not only language and image, but high and low, and any oppositional pairing one can think of freely mix. So, according to her, every material support, every medium is leveled by the homogenizing principle of commodification that transformed everything into, commodity. And it's at the very heart of the work of Marcel Brothers, of course. But she goes on, and I quote again. Television and video seem hydra-headed, existing in endlessly diverse forms, spaces and temporalities, for which no single instance seems to provide a formal unity for the whole. This is what Sam Weber has called television's constitutive heterogeneity, she says. And according to Rosalind Krauss, this evolution of art towards the disappearance of disciplines and the entering of the domination of TV as a model, as a format, has become, with the work of Marcel Brothers, was in a way the Trojan horse for this disastrous evolution. And here we are talking about somebody, in a way, who still believes that the medium is a tool against this banalization of art. But one could think totally differently, actually, and say that, for example, the most interesting works that are produced today are, at the opposite, transcoding one format into another, translating one form into another, and making this passage through one format to another valuable in itself. To think is to translate, and some artists produce by translating, actually. I'm thinking, for example, into many different works by Pierre Huyghe, translating one sound into an image, one architecture into an opera, one expedition into a film, etc., etc. You have a perpetual transcoding of formats. You have one original form that is translated into many, many, many different forms after that. You have, for example, in the work of Jan Gillick, also a lot of transcoding between text and image. And I think that one of the most interesting projects that happened in the recent years, which is the project Anne Lee, was also based on transcoding. The project, which was initiated by Pierre Huyghe and Philippe Parreno, consisted in buying a manga character and having this manga character living her own life in a way, and transcoded from one artist to another. And the form that of the adventures of this character was very heterogeneous, actually, and there was a permanent transcoding between the two. And what is interesting is the way Philippe Parreno is talking about it when the project's over. He says, "It was for me a simple act of exposition, the passage from hand to hand of a sign. Anne Lee was a flag with no cause. The cause was inventing itself from hand to hand." And you have a very good image of this transcoding spirit, actually. I would quote also, for example, a very recent piece by Jonathan Wolfson, which is the translation in gesture language for the unhearing of the discourse of Charlie Chaplin in The Great Dictator. It was shown at the Whitney Museum last year. Or you have Jonathan Monk translating one work of Robert Barry, a conceptual artwork, which is composed of a writing piece, in several languages. Graham Gussin with transforming a porn film into wavelength of colors. You have Sadan Afif, also in France, who's transforming André Caderet's work from the 70s in color chords, then into chords that are played by guitarists. But I could talk also about Kelly Walker, Wade Gitton, Pete Coffin, Josh Smith in America at the moment, who are basing their whole artistic process on the notion of transcoding an image from one format to another. And this will for transcoding is coming as a kind of reconstitution as a substitute for universalism, in a way. It's not the postmodern eclecticism anymore. It's not modern universalism. Translation as an ethics, in a way, and a way to produce also, is slowly constituting itself as a way of thinking in itself, as a possible, renewing of culture. And I might stop here, maybe if we don't want to. Right?
Sí, podemos Bueno, pues.
Maybe before tomorrow, actually, that's why I'm talking about the precarious and precariousness tomorrow after post-production, because this precariousness is inscribed into this mental model. Actually, well, we'll go on further about it.
abro yo el fuego para romper el hielo para empezar. Te pregunto en español. Sí, vale. Bueno, mi pregunta era, está relacionada con la cuestión de la memoria. ¿Hasta qué punto esa articulación que presentas o esa dualidad entre el radical como figura de la modernidad unido a la raíz, al origen, y el radicante como figura de la transmodernidad, por no decir postmodernidad, que ya no tiene ese anclaje en el pasado, no puede ser analizado desde el punto de vista, o no puede ser visto desde el punto de vista de la memoria? Y traigo una idea de un crítico español, José Luis Brea, pero bueno, que también es una manera de enfocar las cosas, como una dualidad entre memoria ROM y memoria RAM. Una memoria ROM, como que tienen los ordenadores de archivo, una memoria de pasado, y una memoria RAM como una memoria de uso, ¿no? ¿Hasta qué punto el radical y el radicante no podrían estar relacionados, el radical con una memoria de archivo, de anclaje, que pues evidentemente siempre hay RAM, no hay RAM sin ROM, ni ROM sin RAM, pero hay un paradigma esencial que es el paradigma del archivo, el paradigma del anclaje de la memoria, de la raíz, y ese radicante no se relaciona más con un paradigma de uso, como un paradigma de memoria RAM. Si al final crees que puede estar relacionado esa idea con los usos de la memoria.
Claramente sí. He escrito algo sobre esto en postproducción actualmente, sobre el facto que ahora la arte es una, ¿cómo se llama? Una toolbox. Gracias. Que es el papel de la historia del arte y la manera con la cual los artistas le utilizan hoy. Es el modelo dominante para mí de relación con la historia, de relación con la memoria. Es este modelo, es el modelo de uso. Que me parece, es Deleuze, que había escrito, necesitamos mucha memoria para olvidar el pasado. Me parece que es más o menos la misma idea. Y hay otra figura que me interesa, hablando de esto, es la figura de Jorge Luis Borges. Especialmente hemos hablado de esto, una historia que se llama Tlön Uqbar Orbis Tertius, en la cual describe una civilización donde no hay diferencia entre el pasado y el futuro. Por ejemplo, arqueología les parece ciencia ficción y es todo al mismo nivel. Y es muy interesante porque por todo el siglo XX los artistas han intentado de lograr, ¿cómo se dice? To find.
Contesta en inglés.
To find. Encontrar el nuevo en el futuro. Pero ahora podemos decirnos que podemos también hacer descubiertas en el pasado. Y descubiertas en el futuro es exactamente simétrico, es exactamente lo mismo actualmente. No necesitamos el futuro como un modelo absoluto. Y es también una nueva relación con la historia. Y es lo que me interesa en esta noción de arqueología y como los artistas hoy son arqueológicos.
Sigo por una cosa. Aquí esto del uso del micrófono siempre es obsceno y perverso, pero... Entonces, hablas de un nuevo uso del tiempo. ¿Hasta qué punto puede llegar a ser el uso que has hablado del radicante casi semejante o puede llevar implícito quizá el modelo temporal de los sueños, en el sentido de Freud, el modelo de la condensación, de que no hay un antes y un después, sino que es el modelo del tiempo condensado, porque precisamente el radicante, tal y como lo describes, al no tener un anclaje, al poder desarrollarse por medio de la transcodificación, en esa transcodificación está condensado todo el pasado. No hay un archivo, sino que el archivo se va moviendo, el archivo está condensado. De alguna manera, el presente, pasado y futuro, pues no hay manera de saber dónde se encuentran. Quizá un modelo inconsciente, una temporalidad inconsciente o condensada pueda servir.
Claramente, pienso que sí. Y hay una otra noción que es interesante con el sueño, es la noción de desplazamiento también, y que corresponde claramente a esta forma que intento de dibujar, vamos a decir, teóricamente. Y quizás hablaremos de esto mañana, pero hay un tipo de formas que me interesan hoy mucho, que son lo que he llamado trajectory forms, trajectorial forms, in a way, que no están estáticos, pero como en las instalaciones de Jason Rhodes o de Tomoko Takahashi o de Thomas Hirschhorn, no puedes ver la totalidad de la instalación cada vez. Tienes que estar como visitor una especie de realizador, de cierta manera. Tienes que seleccionar tus secuencias. Y es muy interesante porque hay alguien que es muy interesante en esta generalización de lo que llamo forma trayectoria, no se dice. Es también el facto que es como una línea de formas, como un flux, stream en inglés, y que más o menos es la misma familia para mí que los viajes, de cierta manera. Hay los sueños, pero los viajes también, me parecen modelos interesantes. Por ejemplo, los viajes de los aborígenes en Australia se llaman walkabouts. Y el walkabout es un viaje iniciático en el cual la persona que lo hace tiene que cantar el paisaje viajando, inventar el paisaje y coloquiar la memoria la memoria histórica y mítica de este paisaje. Puede ser una imagen, un símbolo muy interesante del arte, de las obras de arte de hoy, de cierta manera. Es algo que está de esencia trayectorial y que no se separa a una forma estática. Por ejemplo, hay muchas obras también que no se paran a un lugar, pero que se desarrollan en el tiempo también. Y es algo que es análogo a esta forma de viaje, vamos a decir.
Hola, yo tenía dos preguntas. Una era relativa a este concepto de tiempo en el que el pasado y el futuro, el presente también se mezclan un poco, y quería preguntar por su conexión con la energía, todo lo que estaba hablando al principio. Sobre todo, o sea, yo pensaba en Kubler y precisamente en ese concepto también que luego utiliza tanto Smithson de la entropía y de esa lectura que hace kubleriana para la espiral Yeti, de cómo ese pasado y ese futuro también se mezclan en cualquier momento, en cualquier lugar, en contraposición al tiempo cronológico y al tiempo genealógico. Y luego, por otro lado, es el concepto de traducción. Si tendría algo que ver también un poco con el concepto de Homi Bhabha, de Cultures in Between, de esos que vas de un lugar y vas a otro, y al final acabas que no es ni de un lugar ni de otro, sino es esa otra tercera cultura, ese lugar intermedio, esa cultura de sutura, del entremedio, del in-between. Ya.
Pues es muy difícil que contestar, especialmente en español. No, vuelvo a empezar de tu pregunta. Algo que es, pero voy a hablar un poquito de esto mañana, hablando de la modernidad líquida, del concepto de Zygmunt Bauman, que es muy, muy interesante, y que dice que ahora nuestra economía está dominada por la industria de la waste. Desperdicio, del detritus, ¿sabes? ¿No? Ok. Pero al mismo tiempo, la industria del recordar es aún más desarrollada. Es increíble. Ahora se parece que nada se puede olvidar, que no podemos dirigir, ¿cómo se dice? No se puede perder nada. No. Estamos dentro millardes de factos, de objetos, y nada se va. Es algo que es totalmente único en la historia del mundo actualmente, porque antes había muchas cosas que se olvidan muy rápidamente. ¿No? La industria del recordar no era tan desarrollada, y ahora estamos totalmente sumergidos, overwhelmed, para nuestra memoria, de cierta manera. ¿No? Es importante de olvidar, ¿no? Es una de las grandes lecciones de Friedrich Nietzsche. Tienes que olvidar, ¿no? Tienes que dejar las cosas. Si no, tienes que ser más y más gordo, ¿no? Y es una dietética, de cierta manera. Pero podemos volver sobre Homi Bhabha mañana, porque hay muchas cosas que decir.
Bien, pues si no hay más, yo creo que mañana seguro que irán surgiendo, porque se han quedado muchísimas cosas que yo creo que son, pues bueno, por lo menos dignas de ser recordadas, ¿no? Y discutibles en el sentido bueno del término, con lo cual pues nos pensamos si acaso las preguntas que hayan quedado en el tintero, y mañana nos vemos a las 11:30. Muchas gracias.